Welcome to State of Ed, a podcast about education inside the classroom and out. My name is Marc.
And I'm Nick Simone.
How are you doing today, Nick?
Really excited for our guest today. How are you?
Also very excited. I know we both had a long day, but this is a wonderful way to bring that long day to a wonderful end. We have with us Cynthia Taines, who is a sociologist serving as an associate professor at Northern Illinois University, who is dedicated to studying and supporting educational equality. With teachers and organizers, Cynthia co-founded the Metropolitan Community Project, a city-suburban school partnership for educational justice. She is a resident of Chicago, so we definitely need to debate pizza and discuss the bear. Cynthia is also the author of a new book, The Metropolitan Community, Partnering for Equality Across the Educational Divide. I can't think of a more important topic to be discussing in 2026. Cynthia, welcome to State of Ed Podcast.
Thank you so much. It's so nice to be here. I'm excited for our conversation.
Oh, as we are.
As are we. So can you just tell us a little bit about your journey in education and how you've gotten to the place that you are currently as an associate professor at a really great university?
Yeah, actually, I didn't start out thinking I would be in education. When I was an undergrad, I actually wanted to be a veterinarian, very different than helping kids. But I got really interested in social issues on my college campus. It was a very active college campus. I went to UC Santa Cruz, and there were protests at the time about college tuition and how expensive it was, although nowadays that might look cheaper.
That problem got solved quickly, so
yes.
Good job on that.
There was protests about making sure that there was a diverse and multicultural curriculum. There was an effort to get an ethnic studies department on our campus. And I just got really interested in sort of the human and social world and some of the inequalities. So I started taking classes kind of on the side of my biology classes, like some American studies classes. And I spoke with one of my TAs and I said, I'm interested in equality. What should I do? It's sort of a perfect undergrad, I have all this idealism and energy and, want to do something. And she was the one who told me, I think education, even given how imperfect this system is like our best hope. It's our best sort of frontier to try to solve some of the divides in our society and try to uplift the people who are most marginalized by our society. It's the best tool that we have. It's an imperfect tool, but it's the best tool that we have. And so I got inspired by that and decided to go into education, sort of follow her advice. And so I went to graduate school at the University of Michigan in educational policy studies and focus on sociology so I could understand some of the more underlying inequalities and what they're driven by and potentially some of the solutions to that. And then I kind of kept going. I got my PhD in educational policy studies too. And along the way worked with school districts on thinking about both equality, but how to improve our educational systems. I worked in Detroit public schools while I was a graduate student working on a more hands-on science curriculum. And when I was in Detroit, I definitely, of course, noticed the extreme disparities in school funding and school resources and how some of the curriculum that we were generating, teachers could not always use fully because they didn't always have the technology. And we had this hands-on curriculum where students were meant to be outside, testing water quality to learn about chemistry, for example. But it was really difficult to get the transportation to go on those field trips. And so I just started thinking more about what are some of the limits that are being imposed on city school systems and how, we might improve them. And also along the way, I'm just really interested in student voice. What do students think of their education? How do students think we can improve it? And so that's kind of how I kind of wended my way on this journey to being an education professor, training pre-teachers on some of the same issues that struck me as a college student, wanting to get involved, and also still working with students and young people about how they can get involved in their educational system.
Wow.
Yeah, one of the reasons I'm so excited is because we spend a lot of time interviewing people more about the art, the practice, the fundamentals of teaching. We do a lot with technology, but I'm really excited to talk about policy.
Oh, excellent.
We don't always get that opportunity, right? Agreed, Marc?
This is Nick's
Yeah,
wheelhouse. He is licking his chops right now for
yeah, I'm
sure.
very, very excited. So, but first, I'm just going to ask, like, when you were in high school yourself,
Hmm.
was this something that you were in tune to in terms of? I'm always curious,
Hmm.
people that go into education, like how much
Yeah.
they're aware of it when they're younger.
Yeah, I actually think not. That I was not aware of the huge differences in education. I do feel like maybe one of the only things that kind of stuck with me related to the high school experience, which I think a lot of others might relate to, is like this sort of feeling of not quite fitting, like not quite fitting in, not just into, with peers, which I think a lot of times students struggle with, but just not quite fitting with the educational system and what I was being asked to do. I do think I have a little bit of hangover from that from high school, and just thinking about it for myself, like how can we create a system where students feel like they belong and that they're fully supported. So I had little inklings of that I think has been motivating me, but not a real awareness about these large school differences. Like many people sort of growing up, not necessarily traveling that much to other schools and school systems, and really seeing for myself what those differences look like.
In the Michigan area, are the suburbs smaller districts as well as like what they would be on Long, like we're in New York.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
So the districts here, obviously the New York City School District is its own entity.
Right.
Marc started his career there
Hmm.
and attended, right, Marc?
Oh yeah,
You're proud of it.
proudly.
And then the suburbs are just very localized
Hmm.
school districts.
Yes. Yeah.
We also know, like in Virginia, in North Carolina, Florida, it's more of a county-wide system. So what
Right.
is it like in Michigan?
In Michigan, it is more split up with like the city Detroit public school system, and then surrounding suburbs having their own school systems, and sometimes very much much smaller micro school systems. I'm also originally from California, and there's a lot of similarities there as well. So, for example, the Bay Area, in that there are a lot of city school systems and surrounding suburban school systems, and sometimes they're like right next door, but they have very separate educational opportunities and experiences for students.
Is it safe to assume that some of those suburban areas perhaps have greater per pupil spending due to perhaps a higher tax base in those suburban regions versus the urban region? Is that fair to
Yeah,
assume, like
yeah,
a Long Island, New York situation?
definitely. And I think that's sort of a nationwide. I know we can't necessarily make generalizations about all school districts, but they sort of one of the primary drivers of this inequality in school funding is this reliance on local property taxes that are raised only within the school district boundaries. So basically, those funds stop at the school district borders. And that means that kids who sometimes only live a couple of miles away will not have the same funds or resources or opportunities available to them.
So the primary focus of your book is the urban suburban divide, right? The inequality, the inequity that exists
Yes.
there. How did you go about like just conducting your research and
Hmm.
getting data for the work?
Yeah, so I actually started with an educational program that came sort of before the research. When I moved to Chicago, I had already been really interested in city suburban school divides, and I was curious about whether there was like some kind of program that brought city and suburban schools, students and teachers together. And I did a couple, forays to try to understand if that existed, and I did find a few programs that were kind of like more like exchange programs. So they were kind of like one shot programs where maybe students would visit once, to another school district. I also heard of some programs that had more volunteering opportunities. So maybe more affluent school districts students going to a less affluent school district to provide some kind of service like community service, beautifying the grounds or providing tutoring for students. So I had heard of something like that, but I was really interested in what the possibilities were of creating a true partnership and also a more sustained partnership. And I didn't find one when I moved to Chicago, so I built one myself.
Wow.
Yeah, so I got to know a Chicago public schools teacher, and she had just been going out on family leave, but she introduced me to one of her colleagues in a school that I call Taylor in the book, which is a Chicago public school in a lower income neighborhood. It's also a neighborhood school. And I know in New York has some similar, but maybe not all your audience has that awareness that sometimes city school systems are split up into what are called neighborhood schools and more selective schools that require some kind of application. And typically the city will kind of throw more resources towards those schools' way. So I was working with a neighborhood school, so more traditional, underfunded school in Chicago. And so she introduced me to a teacher, a social studies teacher there. And then I was teaching a graduate class, actually at a suburban school north of Chicago. Sometimes we do these off-site classes where professors teach, kind of go to this rather than having the students come to us. And so I taught a school on this suburban high school campus. And so after class, I started asking around. And so a teacher in that class introduced me to another teacher who taught at the school that I call Wyndham, which is it's about 25 minutes away from the other school, Taylor, but it is spent more than double per student, and it is quite an affluent area and predominantly white area. And so we just started to do this, like, what would this experiment look like? The Chicago teacher that I initially started working with also introduced me to a community-based organizer, felt like we were certain that we wanted to have some kind of collaborative action, not just seeing these two schools, but actually working with students to try to figure out what to do about the differences they saw. So we also partnered with a community-based organization. So we met in the summer before and sort of mapped out what it would look like. And then the teachers recruited in their classes, their after school clubs, if they sponsored those. And we started the project up in the fall. So we kind of ran this program, and right away I was following students around, scribbling notes, and I did before and after interviews. Students to try to understand what was happening. And at first we were just mostly using that information to try to improve the project each year and improve the partnership each year. But eventually I really wanted to consolidate, okay, what am I actually learning? So I decided to write it.
You saw something bigger there, right?
Yeah.
In your experience, have you come to a conclusion perhaps that these disparities are almost normalized to some degree?
Yes.
So what are the drivers behind that kind of normalization?
Well, it's interesting. I think they're normalized for adults, but not kids. And so the students were really shocked. And when they learned, because we also, we're educators too. So we also taught them, this is how school funding works. And this property taxes, and this is how it works. They were just really shocked. What do you mean you have the funding for a school based on how wealthy a community is? How could it possibly work that way? So they were actually shocked, and they were also shocked about the differences they were seeing. But I do feel like it's settled into normalcy for adults, that this is just how it works. If you especially for middle class and more affluent people, they're just sort of this sort of baseline understanding. If you want to go to quote unquote good school, you just move. You have to move and pay for a house that will get you access to that, as if that's the regular way things would work, even though this is a public school system that is intended to provide opportunities for everyone. So I do think it's somewhat normalized, and unfortunately it also gets normalized for students and families sometimes who are attending underfunded schools. It's not like they don't notice that there are some obstacles and barriers in their way, of course they do, but in some cases it's sort of hard to imagine what else schools could provide if you're only ever interacting with the system that you're in. And so the city kids were also shocked just by what the range of possibilities that were available, in the suburban school. And the suburban students were of course shocked at some of the things that
wasn't available, right?
They took for granted, that of course all schools have this, and then they walked into the city school and that was not always the case. Yeah.
The frustration for people, like you who are doing such great work, is that we're still trying to get people to understand that kids are basically the same no matter where they are.
Yes.
Maybe the numbers might be a little bit different, but there are talented, brilliant, precocious, hardworking kids in every building. There are kids struggling in every building. And it's because of the environment that they're in that you get the outcomes. So I think the work that you're doing is trying to like expose that, and then of course I can't wait to get to the solutions. But I'll wait. I'll wait for that, right now. So the work that you've done with this book, was it specifically just those two schools? That's the focus of it?
That's the focus of this book in particular, but we have actually, as part of the project, in different years and different iterations, we have actually worked with other schools. We worked out with a couple other Chicago schools and also another suburban school as well. I just decided to like try to focus the story a little bit, but we did have that sort of broader range throughout the project, and that was interesting as well because of course I'm mostly focused on the urban suburban divide, and I think that that is like a huge part of the story that our society just has to face. But we do also within city school systems, of course, have disparities as well. And so when we involved more than one Chicago school, students also noticed that, like that there were different opportunities even within Chicago. And then also when we involved, of course, suburban schools are also different from each other, and so we also were able to observe that as well. So that created like it just present a very complicated picture, many different kinds of inequity.
Chicago have specialized schools with entrance exams like New York City does as well?
Yes, yeah. So frequently they call them selective enrollment schools. There's also magnet schools, but yeah, these are schools that require an application, and some of them are so selective that they have lower admissions than selective Ivies schools. So they can be really really difficult to get into, and in some ways that does create a very tiered and hierarchical system within the city, with certain students having sort of more opportunities. And of course the other thing that we've seen within Chicago is that those more selective schools often don't look as much as like the city as a whole, that we have seen a greater concentration of higher income students in some of those selective schools. They are still like incredibly diverse, and so in that way they can in some ways reflect the city as a whole, but not quite, especially not quite as economically, and even sort of according to racial background, we see the same kind of diversity that we see in the city as a whole, and certainly in comparison to some of our neighborhood schools.
Sounds like she's describing New York City, right?
Yeah.
Doesn't it, Nick?
No, it's really, because that's a big debate in New York City.
Yes.
And what do we have, Marc? Like 8 specialized schools, I believe. I think
it depends. It depends
what they call
if you're old school. What you consider the old school specialized schools versus the ones that have come on the last 15, 20 years. But yeah, somewhere in that ballpark.
And go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just thinking that I think one of the things that happens when you have a system like that is that people point to that inequality within the city and be like, okay, so that's the real story. But I do actually think that sometimes what city school systems are doing is like there is actually not enough funding to make sure that all schools are resourced in the way that those selective enrollment schools are. And so they end up concentrating the few dollars they have sort of like, on those schools in a particular way that still indicates that there is this larger problem, that if the city school system was funded, adequately and equitably, then perhaps the city could provide more opportunities in more schools that were similar to those more selective schools.
Do the federal funds, like the Title I, Title II, Title III funds, do they even come close to bridging the divide, or are they not even coming close to that?
I think they help. And of course, that those funds are targeted towards, for like Title I funds, for example, towards lower income school populations. But so it definitely helps, and the divide would be worse. But yeah, we're seeing in the state of Illinois, we're seeing school funding differences that are double and triple, so like that there are schools that double and triple the amount of per student spending, and that is largely due to the local spending. When we get to the solutions part, I can say that the state funds have helped to some degree, and so that is like part of the advocacy that our little project was working on.
Before we get to the solutions part, I just want to ask, like, I can only imagine in conducting this research and working with these, different populations, there have to be times when there are perhaps uncomfortable conversations about privilege, about race, about opportunity that have to be had. And you kind of alluded to them a little bit before. How did you observe how young people kind of navigate the tensions created by those conversations versus perhaps how the adults navigate them?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And actually that ended up being a really big focus of the book. I have like a whole section on like some of the communication challenges among these students because when I was following them around scribbling notes, as I mentioned, like when they were touring each other's schools, I was surprised at their lack of verbal surprise, like that there wasn't a lot
Mm,
of like sort of outward expressions and being like, what is going on here? How could it be that there are these schools that have not enough, or how could it be that there's a school, with a radio station and Olympic-sized pool? How could that even be possible? So I was a little bit surprised at the more muted sort of reactions, at least when the kids were in the same rooms with each other. And then, of course, I had this opportunity of interviewing them one-on-one, and then they would be like, "What was that?" So I was like,
right.
"Oh, they're having some challenges saying that to each other. They're having some challenges saying that to each other." And so that's something I was really trying to explore, is to try to think about what were those sticking points, what were those barriers. And one of the things I sort of discovered is that they had a little bit of a conflation between what the circumstances of their school and what they were thinking people would assume about them. And so, for example, like
Mm,
suburban kids who have like overflowing resources at their schools, I think they expressed to me like that they were worried about, we are honest about that and we share that, then that will look, like we're arrogant and snotty and think we're better than everyone else. And the Chicago students also sort of like, if we sort of acknowledge some of the limitations, some of the difficulties and challenges we're having, that will make us look bad. It will make us look, maybe people will assume that we're not trying, to do well in school, that we don't deserve the resources that we have, that we did something wrong. And that's why there's not
mm,
enough here for all of us.
interesting.
So I think they were like kind of fusing the circumstances of their school with what they believe someone would assume about their character, or sort of personality. So, that was sort of one of the real barriers. And then they also had some barriers talking about each other's school, like the city students, which is very sweet in a way. They kind of thought that like it'll be kind of rude to say like, what the heck, you have a radio station, it will make them feel, maybe it'll make the suburban students like feel attacked as if they did something wrong, like
Oh,
like we're blaming them for either the conditions of their school or the conditions of ours, so they wanted to hold back to not make their suburban partners uncomfortable. And similarly, the suburban students were worried that if they pointed out like, oh, it turns out you only have one college counselor and they're only part-time, and you're not able to get as much college advice, that will somehow
right.
be like kind of insulting, like we're pointing out some kind of deficiency in your school. And so like, again, that sort of like made them kind of rein in and sort of hold back. So I kind of go through some of those communication challenges and then sort of talk about like what helped them get through that, what helped them be a little bit more clear and direct and about what they were seeing. And it was actually collaborating together to try to make a difference and to try to make a change. That helped them like perhaps be a little bit more outward focused. Like we're gonna take out whatever challenges and discomfort we have. We're gonna take that out on the system, like it's the system's fault, and we're gonna take it on them, rather than like being worried about how each other are going to, sort of feel. So those are some of the interesting challenges, but also some of the ways we sort of, I think, work through that. And that's why it was so important from the beginning to have an action component built in, that it wasn't just like an
Right.
exchange program where we're visiting two schools, but instead it was about a collaborative action where both groups of students would decide to work on something together, and that they had like a common goal.
Wow.
So yes, I guess it's time for before I'll do my before we get to the solutions question.
Okay.
Well, I just like how you demonstrated and you talked about how complex this is because it's the issue within the city, the fact that there are these specialized schools that everybody can't go to.
Mhm,
There's the city suburban divide.
mhm,
We can speak to the suburban divide. There are some neighboring schools in the suburbs that are vastly different, and we haven't even brought up the rural school
mhm,
system.
mhm.
So all of this shows just how complicated it is. So now, what do you believe are some of the ways we can try to rectify this? The realistic ones,
Uh-huh.
the pie in the sky solutions.
Mm.
How can we address this divide?
Yeah, and I can tell you about some of the things like sort of like that we actually did that
Okay.
I do also think made a difference. And it's interesting you brought up the rural schools too. So like what we ended up doing, and this was actually we met as a whole project. So with the students who were there with a state legislator, and we kind of asked him that question that you just asked, like if we're seeing these differences, the students were asking, like, what would you suggest? What would make the biggest difference to you as a politician or to the body that you represent as a state legislature? Like, what would make the biggest difference? So he actually was the one who suggested, like, he had been the target of another campaign about healthcare, and he thought it was really effective. And so he kind of gave this idea to the students about, I think that if you wrote handwritten letters and handwritten so that it would feel sort of more personal rather than a typed up letter. If you wrote a handwritten letter that talked a little bit about your experience in this project, like what you have or don't have at your school, what you saw about the other school, what you saw about the differences. And if you wrote a letter and you mailed those, your project and your teachers who are helping you sent those letters to every state legislator and asked to meet with them, I think that could start
Mm,
building some political momentum to try to make a difference, at least with how the state's funding is distributed, that could help compensate for some of these differences in local funding. Because he basically said, we all know this, but we know this on like the cerebral kind of like abstract level, going back to the normalization that we were talking about before. It's like, of
right.
course, we know that there are differences in these schools, but it's not hitting people on sort of a gut human level. And so he talked about, like, I think this could make some kind of difference. So we did do that. We, got all our students together and they talked about what they were going to write. And the community-based organizer helped us come up with a sentence at the bottom that was like a common ask, which is like a very common sort of advocacy technique. What's your ask?
Hmm.
Of the political system. And so we initially just asked, we want to meet with you. And so we copied the letters at the suburban school because they had all the supplies in the world. So we copied all packets of letters, sent them to every state legislature in the state of Illinois. and,
Wow.
and then they wrote us back, and some of them did, of course, not all of them, but they wrote us back and offered to do these meetings. And so we started having meetings with, in not every instance could all of our entire participation of the project come, but like definitely we had representatives from some city and suburban schools, and we met with the state legislators, and they kind of gave a similar version of their letter about here's the differences, here's what we saw, here's why that matters to me. And will you kind of sign on to being someone who supports school funding change and reform? And it did build. We weren't the only ones working on this, and there was a bill in the state legislature that was It's called a needs-based funding reform bill, which I can talk a little bit more about. But there was a proposal in the state legislature that kept getting defeated. And so one
Mm.
of the things that we were trying to do is sort of build more outside sort of political momentum to try to see if this law could be passed. And so we weren't the only ones who worked on it. We actually went to Springfield, to the state capital of Illinois, and we learned how to lobby. And the
That's
students
great.
were amazing, and like intercepted politicians on their way to the chamber to be like, let's talk about school funding and why it matters to me. And
Wow.
that bill passed. It passed. It took several years, but it did pass. It passed by almost squeaker no votes margin. And so there is starting to be this greater infusion, this needs-based funding reform that is starting to fill the gap. It definitely has not closed, but it's definitely better than it was 5 years ago.
That's amazing. And
Um,
what about beyond money? Obviously, money's huge. I don't mean to
Yeah.
diminish that
Yeah.
whatsoever, but mindset, culture,
Yeah.
perspective, perception.
Yeah. And
To what extent do those have impact
yeah.
this divide as
I
well?
think that's a good question, because I think part of this project and the book is about policy advocacy, but it's also about bringing communities together that are typically divided. And so that's actually the cultural shift and mind shift that I'm interested in, is that I think we are in such divided communities, and how you kind of opened our conversation saying, like, this is something we really need to talk about in 2026. Like, we are clearly divided and polarized,
Yes.
our communities are really separate, but they're often right next door to each other, and we aren't crossing those boundaries, and we are not talking to people who live fairly close to us but are leading totally different lives, and they are having completely different school experiences. And so one of a kind of a cultural shift that I'm kind of interested in is how do we bridge those divides? How do we create more communication and more authentic communication, so that we can really see and understand and feel how other people live, and that may reduce some of the negativity and anger that we're seeing across these divides, but it also may increase collaboration across communities to try to help solve problems that are really our collective problems to solve. Like, this is not a Chicago problem to solve. This is not a New York City problem to solve. These are our collective problems about how do we have the best public educational system that we can have in this country. And so in order to do that, we are going to have communities working across each other, like not just working within people working within their divided community. So that's a real culture shift that I'm interested in thinking about.
that's fascinating. I could listen all day. No,
So
it's
let me ask this question, Dr. Taines, just as
Sure.
a maybe just to kind of bring our conversation to a close. So if someone out there is listening to this,
Mhm.
a school leader, district leader, community leader, and they want to replicate some of these ideas, some of the work that you're mentioning here, because unless you can replicate yourself and put yourself in every community across America, we're going to need other people to pick up on some of these things. So how does an individual like that move from like good intentions to meaningful action?
Yeah, and I especially wrote this book for educators, and I tried to make it the least amount of academic ease in this book as possible. It is like
Thank you.
it is intended to be like accessible, poignant, funny. There's like foreshadowing, so I wrote it a little bit using some like fiction techniques, even though it's completely nonfiction and research based. But I wanted to make it something that like moves you, and that is accessible and understandable to a breadth of people. So I'm especially excited about teachers and administrators reading the book, and I kind of wrote it for them actually. And what I'm hoping, and I have a section at the back that says conclusion with next steps, because I really hoping that educators could take some of those next steps. I know this from teaching at a university in pre-teacher educator preparation programs, that I have students in my classes from all over the state and sometimes from out of state, and then they're going to go get jobs and work in all different school districts. But for a time, for 4 years or 5 years, how long it takes students to get their degrees, they've gotten to know people from all these different school districts and from all these walks of life. I really think that that's like a really interesting like resource. And then for people who've already been in the field, like like some of you, like you also have probably had, you might have had multiple jobs where you've worked in many different school districts, or you have friends who work in other school districts. So we have this resource of all these like strong connections that we have across these school districts, across many of the divides that we've been speaking about today. And so how could educators maybe think of like, who do I know that's right next door in that next neighboring school district? How could we maybe bring some of our students together in a sustained and authentic way, in a way that they're collaborating together on an action project? Because as I said, I think that's a really important piece, so that they could build their own sort of school partnership. They could build their own sort of momentum for crossing some of these divides. So that's what I'm really curious about. And I do think there's definitely a labor of love, and of course the teaching profession itself is a labor of love. So
Right.
it is like an added thing, but I do think it is doable and possible to think about, like, who are the people we know, how can we collaborate them to bring some of our students together, so that they have these experiences of seeing these disparities, of getting to know kids who are on the opposite side of the educational divide, and of collaborating together on something that can make this system better.
The most prominent sociologist that I know by name is Matthew Desmond. So here's to hopefully you becoming the Matthew Desmond of education policy. How's
Thank
that
you.
sound?
Appreciate it.
Because when
Thank you.
I believe it was actually, might have been Dr. Roberts' class that assigned Matthew Desmond's Evicted. I could be
Oh,
wrong on that.
yeah.
I think you're right.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I was kind of blown away by the work that he did,
Yeah.
on the housing crisis. And
Mm-hmm.
I think people that are interested in, your subject, which we're a little bit biased, but we think is the most important one because it encompasses everything. I
Right.
always say all of our you're talking about how divided we are. All the problems in society, if you want to find one place to solve them, it's in
Mm-hmm.
the schools.
Yeah.
Create an equitable school system and so many other problems. So thank you
Great.
so much for taking the time. We really enjoyed
Of
meeting
course.
you and
So fun.
wish you the best of luck with the book.
It's so fun.
So if someone wanted to reach out to you, find you on social media, learn more about the book and learn more about your work, Dr. Taines, how can they find
Yes, well, you can purchase the book. I have it right here. This book, the Metropolitan Community partnering, partnering across the for equality across the educational divide, and you can find the book on the independent bookstore site, the bookshop.org. You can also find it through my publisher, which is Myers Education Press, and I am on Instagram at Cynthia Taines Author, which you can find me there. And I also have a website called cynthiataines.com where I'm going to post some of the events I'm doing. And I know your listeners are from all over, but I do have some events coming up at my university at NIU, doing a book lot, and I'm also doing an event in Chicago, and so I can give some information about that if people are local and are interested in coming. So I really appreciate this opportunity to share a little bit about my work, and I hope people find the book and are able to get something out of it. And if anyone wants to think about how to create these school partnerships, I am definitely available. You can contact me through my website, and I'd love to help you think about how to get started.
Thank you. And we can't let you leave without you answering one final question. Deep dish pizza or New York style Neapolitan pizza?
I think I'm more of a thin person, but like thin
Hmm.
crust person, but like every once in a while I just want to go super indulgent. And so I do the thick crust, but it's a little bit more rare. So I think I'm a thin crust person.
Do you head to Lou Malnati's when you have those urges? Is that
I've
where
had
you're off to?
there's also a pizza place called Pequod's that makes a deep dish pizza in a cast iron pan, so it gets all like caramelized, kind of like almost burnt, but not quite on the edges. So
Charred.
yeah, so that's that. It's like cheesed, caramelized on the edges. It's really good, also.
I could be
Awesome.
swayed on that a little bit, but I'm definitely a thin crust
Okay. So we
guy
are
just because I have to be, if I want to be able to like walk around my neighborhood.
right. See, we did cross some divides right here.
This is what you're talking about. The whole book is about this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. Dr. Taines, thank you so much for your time, your insights, and sharing all your important work with us and our audience.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.